So, you sleep, and a bedded sensor beneath your bedsheet records with unerring frequency your heartbeat, respiration cycles, and other kinds of bodily movement. And then when you wake, your consciousness is greeted by a numerical sleep score. You consider its evaluation of how your sleep must have been. You work. In place of caffeine, you attach a triangular patch onto your scalp. Think uses a variant of cranial electrotherapy stimulation. It has an energy module which promises to augment your productivity even if you yourself may not notice it happening. You track. This is simply called the Feel. It is a wristband that tracks galvanic skin response, blood volume pulse, and skin temperature in order to deliver real-time recommendations. So it might tell you to laugh more or meditate, even if you might think you feel just fine. And finally, we retire into the bedroom. Before sexual intercourse, you simply toss your smartphone onto the bed like so. Spreadsheet will automatically track duration, number of thrusts, and loudness. It's a real thing. It exists. You can get it. I mean, after all, this is not very surprising because sex, just like jogging and sleeping, emits a lot of usable data for quantifying, for averaging, for prediction, for optimization. So that's the kind of things that I want to talk about today. I think at this stage, self-tracking is part big business, part big dreams. Wearables are now 12 billion market by some count. Some people say that we now have more things connected to the internet than we have people. So the children of the cloud are sort of starting to outnumber us. And there's flagship products like Fitbit, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, looking to make the practice truly widespread. Now, to be sure, this idea of ubiquitous tracking of sensor-rich environments, that idea has been around for decades. People have hyped it as just around the corner for decades. So all the way back in 1982, you had Carnegie Mellon, which wired its vending machine onto the internet so that it could automatically display stock of Coke. In 1990, I know this looks vaguely like a voodoo ritual, but in fact it was the world's first internet-connected toaster. So we've had these kinds of things happen before. It's true. But it is only over the last 7 or 8 years that we're seeing the affordability and miniaturization of what we call smart sensors, and of course the wireless connections and cloud storage capacity that allow us to put it all together. So we're seeing this reach the threshold necessary for a more versatile and mass deployment. So all of this goes by many names, right? The Internet of Things, ubiquitous computing, wearables, and all of those terms actually refer to slightly different, if overlapping, categories of objects. Today I'm trying to focus on self-tracking, that is to say hardware or software solutions that utilize these smart sensors to surveil individual subjects' everyday lives, from physiological signals to social habits to sex. And these typically promise an unprecedented level of automation and intimacy. That is to say, they are independently operating machines that try to measure, they say, the deepest parts of you, and thus deliver, allegedly, more objective kinds of self-knowledge. Now, with every new, let's get him out of the way a little bit, now with every new apparatus for knowledge, every new system of data production, we tend to see a change in the epistemic structure. So these are the questions of what counts as knowledge or information in the first place? Who or what is doing the work of knowing? What kind of veridical authority, that is to say truth-telling authority, is granted to the subject and what is taken and given to the machine? So that's the kind of issues that I want to briefly diagnose here vis-a-vis the public presentation of self-tracking technologies. But let's go back to our examples. So we had bedded, which tracks respiration cycles during sleep, think, which stimulates the brain directly, the feel wristband that measures GSR, spreadsheets that measures thrusts. Now, this kind of tracking exploits the fact that humans have always discharged data to the world. They have always made themselves available for surveillance in all kinds of ways. So, as an example, in the pre-computing age, you have Sherlock Holmes, who could read the innumerable traces clinging to each body, its dress, its posture. And Holmes was exploiting these physical traces. These traces were valuable because they tell a truth that bypasses the silent, uncooperative, or otherwise difficult subject. I don't need to say anything. You can already read where I have been and what I have done. In the place of something like this, self-tracking devices are harvesting digital data that humans emit and discharge constantly. We can't help it anymore. Now, the difference is that in the latter system, we're talking about traces that the subject is not equipped to sense in the first place. Something like galvanic skin response. That's the persistent level of electrical conductance in your skin. So you're always doing it, but you don't even feel it, and you have no way of really feeling it unless something goes terribly wrong. So if Sherlock is human senses and cognition overclocked, tracking devices are seeking to and promising to enable a different level of epistemic access altogether. So, in other words, the automatic and persistent collection of bodily traces often involves a certain undercutting or bypassing of my own intuitive and experiential access to myself. So in line with Mark Hansen and his recent work translating Whiteheadian philosophy into new media, we might call this machinic sensibility, the machine's ability to sense humans at a level that humans cannot do themselves. Now again, there's a broad formal continuity with older historical forms, but there is a difference in how specifically knowledge and knowing is positioned. So you have older examples, let's say mnemonic technologies. You had older cases of oral poetry where the construction of these meters allowed you to remember and piece epic tales together. You had something like medieval reliquaries, which were basically a form of wearables. They were prosthetic technologies for triggering your memory as to the various tales of Christ when you prayed. Now, these kinds of technologies were different because they were enhancing an existing and subjective form of self-knowledge, the technology of human memory. Things start to change when you get something like, let's say, the weight scale in the late 19th century, early 20th century, because self-knowledge is starting to become represented and accessed in a different order, a different and quantified order. And today we find, again, a slightly new configuration. To engage in to engage in self-tracking is to arrange the self to be tracked by a hive of learning machines whose activity is often too fast, too deep, too complex to be accessible to the conscious experiencing subject. So if we've been talking about black boxes for a while now, this is black boxes at a structural level and a phenomenological level. This is especially the case when measurement, prediction, data-driven action, all of these things start to occur in an interconnected, automated, and environmental kind of schema. So again, a comparison, when you have someone like Benjamin Franklin back in the back earlier, when he's noting his performance according to the 13 virtues each day. So he's going to this table he's made himself each night and checking whether he has conformed to these virtues. But that's a very discrete and ritualized process. The interpretive faculty of the thinking subject is central to data curation. The mind grapples with the day's squabbles with the neighbor, and you ask yourself, have I been temperamental? Meanwhile, today you have someone like Tal Milburn, an active self-tracking connoisseur, who has set up his home such that a bunch of domestic furniture in every room glows in different colors according to his life score, and he put it up on his web as well. So if his USB stick or his lamp glows blue, then the score is very high. If it glows red, then he is told that he's not doing very well. Milburn calculated his life score, so it's an algorithm that calculates it based on his net worth, the performance of his investments, US market volatility, his weight, his activity, his sleep, his age, what he is doing right now, and even his estimated remaining lifespan. So here, what you see is the subject's perception of sensing machines itself becomes atmospheric rather than discrete, continuous and rhythmic. And the self becomes known at a level that the subject cannot actively keep track of. This kind of privileged position, according to machinic sensibility, given to a machinic sensibility, this fantasy of bypassing the human, this in turn raises a set of questions about the role of the human subject and the kind of relation I have to my own data. So for instance, self-tracking has been described as a more humanizing technology. So here the rhetoric is, amongst self-tracking enthusiasts, there are some seats down here, the rhetoric goes, For centuries, we humans have lived and suffered. We've lived like a blind amnesiac, feeling our way through the maze of our own body and mind. What did I eat last? Why am I so tired? Why am I so unhappy? Am I even unhappy relative to how unhappy I was a day ago? So the argument goes, you can't even tell. You just don't have the right equipment. We're really poor machines that way. So then they say, data is different. Now, we can always tell fibs to ourselves about eating too much and running too little, right? You might have had an 8-hour workday, but you may not even realize that it was composed of 2 hours of web surfing and 37 minutes of coffee brewing, right? But again, this is the rhetoric. They say the data will not filter out your momentary indiscretions, your corner cutting, and it will not parley with your pitiful excuses. All of this comes into relief, I think, when, skip this one, all right. All this comes into relief when metrics enter into aspects of our lives that have previously been considered too subjective, too holistic, too private, too intuitive. So this is People Keeper. People Keeper is an app that promises to tell you that one friend makes you the most scared and another makes you the most aroused. So you learn in this quantified, measured sense exactly who is the most significant contributor to your hopes, your happiness, your anxiety. Users have said, it made me realize the truth. Some have explained that the app gave them the excuse to cut people out of their lives, because now they could go to him and say, Fred, I am not making a profit from this social contract. I really need to cut this off. Now, People Keeper itself was a proof of concept by two artists. It wasn't quite the real thing. It was a provocation. But it does point to real momentum in the industry and amongst amateur enthusiasts towards a machinic apparatus that challenges the privileged position our conscious experience and narratives have. So that's why we have people that speak of planned serendipity, where you're setting up this machinic architecture, this environment that keeps surprising you with ideas about yourself that you didn't even initiate, which really puts this technology in the same kind of train as the socio-technical engineering for nudging and algorithm-driven kind of personalization of the web. It's all about the creation of the context that happens beneath the level of conscious activity. So in all of this, machines might be doing a lot of work, but they require us subjects to become particular kinds of subjects as well. It's a subject curation. We're encouraged to listen to the data, to see ourselves through the data, and ultimately to see ourselves in the way that machines do. This is something that I call data sense, where our sensory access to different kinds of knowledge is itself reconfigured. As an example, a key frontier for this is haptics. So we know that the smartphone and these other kinds of, these days, old school appliances like to beep at you and give you textual alerts. These are the kinds of, and I'm speaking HCI language here actually, so these are the kinds of things that give you sort of hard jolt in your attention. They interrupt you and give you a discrete message. What we've got with some of the new wristband and wristwatch models, including the Apple Watch, is a more persistent, backgrounded, what they call low friction kind of feedback. So this is how it will sort of gently buzz on your wrist. It doesn't say, hang on, stop whatever you're doing and look at the phone. It's more of just learn to take these buzzes on board. You don't even have to look at your watch. It just becomes like a 6th, 7th, 8th sense for you. This is something that you just keep taking on as you go. An even more explicit example is from London-based designer Ling Tan. So she showcased a self-tracking device that would use discomforting or even punishing feedback. So this was designed to give you a flare of intense heat if it detected that your attention was wandering and you were not being productive. I think there was one that made you itch as well. So these are things that train the subject's senses. And we might compare the process here to how pre-modern subjects had an ability to read the stars as they sailed. They learned to read the movement of the local fauna to gauge the weather. So in the turn to haptics, we're seeing a set of new sensory modules that are being attached to us. And it also reprises the role played by skeuomorphic design elements throughout the history of personal computing. I think the recent joke was that somebody showed the floppy disk to a kid and they said, oh cool, you 3D printed the save button. And of course, that's always been part of the point, right? We always had these kinds of designs, the whole language of folders, where we were being trained over the 80s and 90s to learn to use computers as a kind of lived space by importing these kinds of sensory and habitual programs through which we had been trained for office life. So there's a kind of, this is something that other people have called biopedagogy. Self-tracking is presenting here new ways not only to capture the objective truth of the body, but also to program these open wavelengths or frequencies that the human subject needs to be tuned into. So this becomes kind of a basic skill set you need to have. Now, in all of this, to change tack a little bit from, and get away a little bit from how the industry likes to talk about it, I think it's really important to remember that self-tracking is part of a broader trend. No doubt that all of you are making your own connections here to things like, the broader trends in big data, to surveillance in state and corporate context, things like that. Now, self-tracking enthusiasts have positioned themselves as analogous to Stuart Brand and the countercultural influence on personal computing between the 60s and 90s. So this is a story that Fred Turner tells in his book. And it's this idea that back in the day, computers were a military's thing, but then these hippies took it over and turned it into personal computing in the virtual community and cyberspace. Now, that dream didn't really get achieved in its purity. But self-trackers are consciously looking back onto that, and one of the co-founders of this enthusiast movement, not Gary Wolf, but before Kevin Kelly, whose quote you saw, he of course played a major role in the founding of Wired, and before that the Well community. So there's this kind of continuous vision of using new technologies, in this case basically surveillance technologies, for empowerment and democratization. But I think if we're going to start making those comparisons, we need to make another level of comparison. Self-tracking, as I have described it, wants to bypass the excuses and errors of the subject. It wants to force the positivist behavioral body to speak the truth. This is what Jaron Lanier has called the covert return of positivism. But this is very continuous with something like state surveillance and its efforts to bypass the troublesome techniques of confession and just get straight to the proof. Now, that's not to say that this is just as bad as the NSA. My point is, there is a broader trend towards how the self is being demanded by society to speak its truth. What kind of ideas about who we are becomes socially legitimate or socially recognized as valid ways of telling the truth. And so, to be blunt and to draw towards a conclusion, this is ultimately a case where a phenomenological problem is also a political one. The question to be asked is, what kind of veridical authority will the subject continue to hold over his or her data? When do I know myself through my data, and when does my data speak for me? And we're seeing a few incipient trends where Fitbit data was used in a legal case to prove that the person was really doing what they said they were doing in Canada. That's going to become more common. Workplaces, as has been mentioned in the previous panel, they're already trialing the monitoring of every single micro action by their employees. So you're doing self-tracking, but the company requires you to be self-tracking. Last example would be People. Maybe some of you know about this. This is basically a real and creepier version of People Keeper. It has a vision of publicly rating each person on business, romantic, and personal terms, so that you can make sure that when you pick up someone, they have a 7.2 rating on romantic terms, and you know you're going to have a swell time. So my point is this. We're continuing to deploy epistemic structures that privilege machine extensibility, and they're beginning to colonize many of the most traditional areas where human consciousness enjoyed this kind of veridical authority. And so I think self-tracking, incipient as it is, I think it is a key site where we should start asking, what kind of relationship do we want with technology? What kind of development do we want it to have? Because efficiency is not the only way things can go. What fantasies of objectivity and progress do we attach to this magical word, data? And do we want to change this topology of our desires that become attached to our language about internet and technology? Okay, I think that's time for me, so I'll stop here. Thank you.